the Chiefs offensive line versus the Bills defensive line. Like,
ooh, okay.
I mean, like, I don't like to boil games down usually to something so basic, but I mean, this is it, right? When the Chiefs offense has struggled, their offensive line has struggled. When the Chiefs offense has looked like it's still one of, if not the best offense in the league, their offensive line has been dominant. I immediately think back to this Buccaneers game, and I'm glad we were just talking about running the ball because that's like a subcategory of this. If the Chiefs offensive line's feeling themselves, if they can be that aggressor, if they can be that bully of these two units, it's really, really hard to stop this team. If the Chiefs are getting into their gap scheme stuff, if they're starting to run, their single back power, if they're starting to bring, their counter game to this, and they're finding success with it, they become so difficult to stop because of what we've already talked about. You can't play big against them, or Travis Kelce or Juju Smith-Schuster, or somebody's going to eat up a linebacker. You can't just sit there and play a nickel because Orlando Brown Jr. is 360 pounds of man. Trey Smith might as well be, and probably is even stronger. Joe Thuney moves as good as any interior offensive lineman, and stayed with Creed Humphrey. Like, they have guys that can get to all of these smaller players and actually connect to them, and then you can turn out big runs. The problem is the Chiefs don't always get that consistent play out of their offensive line. So far this year, the Bills' defensive line has been outstanding. Like, they have been awesome on inside, outside. The rotation is deep, and the backups are playing almost as good as the starters. There's not really been a weakness there, but I think most people would have said the same thing about the Bucs going into that Chiefs-Bucs game, especially after watching what the Colts did to the Chiefs' offensive line. So it's just one of those things, whether it's pass protection, whether it's run blocking. If the Chiefs' offensive line just simply doesn't get beat like a drum, I feel good about their offensive outlook. If they are getting beat like a drum, if the Chiefs are having to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, what do we need to do differently? Then I get a little nervous because I do think the Bills can put up enough points and it's going to be hard to play catch up in this game if you fall behind. It's like, that's where I'm going to be early and often. It's just, what does this offensive line look? It sounds like Trey Smith is playing again. He missed last week versus the Raiders. It sounds like he's back at practice now. That's good. He's still injured. His ankle, it's going to be listed as a pec. It's his ankle right now. His mobility is not as good as it normally is. So, like, that's something to keep an eye on. But he was still pretty darn good versus the Bucs. And that run game was clicking. The Bucs weren't getting any pressure when they did. It was one guy, not four guys. So one guy getting pressure on Mahomes doesn't usually matter that much. He's pretty okay with making that work. So that's the big matchup. Like, we can talk about Allen and Mahomes and weapons and all this stuff, and they clearly matter and are the best players. But, like, one way to just make simply in this game, I think, is the Chiefs offensive line dominating or the Bills offensive line, defensive line dominating. I think that kind of ends the game either way.
That's almost super on point to what my number one is as well. I have a follow-up question though for you. So this interior, you've got Thuney, you've got Creed Humphrey, who Bills fans love. Bills fans wanted Creed Humphrey instead of Boogie Basham in that draft 2 years ago. Trey Smith, huge value pick. What, taken in the sixth round, fifth round,
fifth or sixth? Yeah, fifth or sixth.
Yeah. Somebody who I liked coming out of Tennessee. I was like, I had like a fourth round grade on him. They get him late. He starts. He does well. We've talked about that interior, and you've alluded to it. They played well. Let's talk about the tackles, Wiley and Orlando.
Let's Brown. Not. We don't have to.
That's exactly what I want to talk about it. Inconsistency at the tackle spots for this team. How are you feeling in terms of like the stability at tackle? Because I know coming into the year it was like, okay, Wiley was probably the biggest question mark, but Orlando Brown has had some peaks and valleys this year that are definitely not what you want to see, especially if you're him and you're trying to just secure a long-term contract. How do you feel about the bookends on this offensive line?
When you're coming into the year, Orlando Brown Jr. struggled to start last year, but by playoff time down the stretch, he figured it out. He was fine to actually pretty darn good in the playoffs for the Chiefs last year. Like, he was not a concern for them. Yeah, certain guys are always going to give him issues just because of his body type, but all in all, he was pretty darn good. You come into this year thinking, oh, wow, another year in the system, another year playing left tackle, plus the rest of these young interior offensive line guys, they're going to be better. Yeah, Andrew Wiley's a question mark, but if he's your clearly your fifth offensive lineman, clearly your worst one is an Andrew Wiley who's finally going to get an offseason to play offensive tackle and not guard and then kick out, you're feeling pretty good.
Yeah.
Year starts, Orlando Brown Jr. looks bad. He looks worse than he did at any point in time last year. And I know there's some rumors about he's playing hurt, but there's just too often he can't get out of his stance to catch up to a speed rusher. I've said this before. Von Miller is the absolute worst nightmare matchup that he can possibly have. Von Miller, he's still got the elite first step. His flexibility to just drop that front shoulder there's going to be plays where Orlando Brown Jr. won't touch him. He simply won't touch him. And yeah, maybe Von Miller will rush deep past 10 yards. But here's the thing. If you go 10 yards deep and you're untouched, it's pretty easy to turn up into the back of the pocket. And that has happened numerous times this year, especially from Yannick Ngakoue, specifically versus Orlando Brown Jr. So like, it's there. And Andrew Wiley's going to fight. He's going to scrap. There's going to be not necessarily highs, but there's going to be lows, but there will mostly, you'll live with it because you know what he is. It's just when you have a problem on both sides, it's an issue. But I will tip the cap to Orlando Brown Jr. He was getting beat like a drum by Chandler Jones in the first half. You didn't really hear his name much in the second half versus the Raiders. He came back out and he held his own. You know, it doesn't always look great. It doesn't always look pretty, but he came back out. He kind of fixed supposedly whatever some of the issues were in that game. I can't pinpoint it. He just looks slow out of his stance sometimes.
I think that's the biggest one. Like, and if you got a speed rusher with a good get off, he's beat before. I think the first sack for Chandler Jones, or the first really good pressure, it's just a strong get off, and he gives that little hop step with the hand swipe, but he almost didn't even need to because he was like past Orlando Brown's midline of his body. He almost could have just kept turning the arc because he beat him so bad off the snap.
Yeah, and that's the thing with Brown last year. If a guy did that to him, he was able to still get hands on them as they were getting up the arc, and you're pushing them. Now you're taking a deep rush even deeper, but you're adjusting their balance. You're adjusting their center of gravity to not get pushed over by your 250, 60-pound self. This year, he's just not even able to get hands on them. And yes, some of it's good rushers with, you know, a dip of the shoulder. Sometimes it's the hands. Like sometimes he is getting got by technique, but he just looks like he can't get there right now. The Chiefs, one saving grace in this. Jerick McKinnon is a menace coming out of the backfield and pass protection. You get to the third and fourth quarter, you will see defensive ends actively go out of their way to take an inside rush when they have no business doing so to avoid their ribs getting hit by him again. Like he
crushed Diablo Monday night. Like he
flipped him.
I think,
I think he took Perryman head on one time too and just stonewalled him. But like even more than just picking up guys, it's the chips out of the backfield. There was a play where Crosby easily had Wiley's outside shoulder. He sees McKinnon coming and he tries an inside spin to a guy that's already on his inside hip and like got nowhere. But like he just didn't want anything to do with it.
No parts.
He's hitting guys. Yeah, he's hitting guys. And this is happening numerous times. Like maybe not early in the game, but third, fourth quarter, you know, McKinnon coming out of the backfield on some of these chips. It's caught some defensive ends' attention. That's about the only way they're surviving some of these outside pass rushes, really.
Very well said. That was a definite question that I had. You alluded to it. I was like, I'll ask it now because I've watched 2 full Chiefs games from the all 22 perspective, and that's something like anytime I notice like pressure coming through, and then also coupled with, you know, watching the Monday night game super intently, like I was noticing just you see that outside pressure, but then I'm thinking like, okay, well, how much of is it? I mean, Crosby is phenomenal. I think people really don't get how sick Max Crosby is, you know, out there in Vegas, and Chandler Jones is no slouch. And so I'm like, okay, is it just, you know, sometimes you got to tip your cap or dude's beating you, but you've seen it because the Colts game is a really good example too. Like, yeah, what Ngakoue was doing, what was happening when they were running games, and just not even necessarily games, just like I'm going to come off the edge with burst and attack and hit that arc. And it's just like, what is going on the outside, especially when you juxtapose it with how strong they are on the interior when healthy. As I mentioned, that's tied to, so the offensive line, defensive line matchup is tied to my number 1 as well. Here we go. My number 1. Can the Buffalo Bills get to Patrick Mahomes? Can they get home? Can they bring him down? I'm also going to tie in, I'll mention quickly, the run piece like I mentioned. The Bills front this year, you alluded to it as well. They've been banged up. They're calling up guys from the practice squad. They're using like 5th string, 6th string, 7th string guys, and they're playing well. Like they're handling double teams. They're strong at the point of attack. They've also started playing a little more gap and a half this year, which is music to my ears in terms of how to stop the run with a light box. Daquan Jones, in my estimation, has been a top 3 player for this Bills defense. He's been a monster. He's giving you some pass rush productivity, but he's just holding it down in the run in a variety of ways. And everything, again, for this Bills defense, they want to just drop 7. That's what they want to do. They want to fit the run with light boxes, and they want to drop 7 into coverage. So much of what their front does affects everything because you can only have those numbers in coverage if you're able to fit the run with lighter boxes and not have to commit another body there. You're only able to play 7 in coverage if you can get pressure with 4. You don't have to blitz if you can get pressure with 4, so on and so forth. And this Bills front has been stout against the run, and they've been good from a pass rush perspective. They've only had to rush 4. They second in the league going into last week at like a 10.2 sack percentage. And considering they're only rushing for the heavy majority of the time, we've all heard the numbers of, oh, they've only blitzed once and look at everything. I'm not even going to get into the numbers. The numbers speak for themselves. The film speaks for itself. What also speaks for itself is what Patrick Mahomes did last year against the Buffalo Bills in terms of being pressured. So in week 5 versus the Buffalo Bills last year, again, a game the Bills won, they sacked Mahomes 3 times. He was pressured on 25.4% of his dropbacks. He dropped back 63 times. He was pressured 25.4% of the time. But the percentage of pressures converted to sacks was only 12.5% in week 5. That's very good. For reference, Josh Allen last year, of all the quarterbacks with at least 20% of dropbacks, there were 40 of them. Josh Allen had the lowest pressures converted to sacks at 10.6%. So that's a very good number, living around there, right? And Mahomes in that week 5, again, win for the Bills, pressures converted to sacks 12.5%. Let's go to the playoff game which the Buffalo Bills lost thanks to some time related to the number 13 that you so kindly reminded us earlier of. Playoffs, 2 sacks for the Buffalo Bills. But here's the kicker. They pressured Mahomes on 39.6% of snaps. They pressured him almost 4 out of every 10 dropbacks, and he dropped back to pass 53 times. So that's like, it's not like it's just a volume part. That's an efficiency part, right? Like that's an individual percentage. They pressured him almost 40% of the time, 39.6%. The pressures converted to sacks, 9.5%, which is phenomenal. That speaks to Patrick Mahomes navigating the pocket, that manipulation. It's something Bills fans talked about all offseason. It's something Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott talked about. That is the impetus for going out and getting Von Miller. You literally go get Von Miller to push you towards a championship. And in specifics, you get Von Miller to get home against teams in general, but against the team that you could not get past in the playoffs, which is the Kansas City Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes. You go out and you get that guy in Von Miller who can play iso ball and get you a bucket at any time in the game. You clear out the paint, you let him work one-on-one, and you go and get points. That's what he was brought in for. And also to create one-on-one opportunities for the other guys that you've brought in to revamp and reinforce this group. You draft Greg Rousseau and Ed Oliver and AJ Epinesa and Boogie Basham to compress the pocket and impact quarterbacks, to get pressure and get home. Again, not to mention all the other defensive line revamping they did this offseason with Daquan Jones and Tim Settle and Jordan Phillips and Shaq Lawson. They completely revamped this group, all to impact how they fit the run and also get home and get to this quarterback. And all of it, again, tying into having the numbers advantage in coverage. Being able to rush 4 and drop 7 means no matter what, you always have the math advantage in coverage. You always have that. Because even if you're just going minimal on offense, right? 5 offensive linemen plus the quarterback, that's 6. 11 minus 6 means you can only get 5 into the route distribution. 7 is greater than 5. Hashtag math. That's an advantage for the Bills, and that's part of what's helped them be able to disguise coverage, like the name of the show. That's why they can live and play games and change the pre to post snap picture and do all these things, because they have that coverage advantage, because they have numbers in coverage. And that is only due to being able to get home up front. They've done it so far to start this year, but they haven't been able to do it successfully against Patrick Mahomes. Again, those numbers are nuts. Even just in the win, again, in week 5, he was pressured over a quarter of his dropbacks, and the pressure converted to sacks was only 12.5%. And then again in the playoffs, to be pressured on 40% of your dropbacks and only be sacked 9.5% out of that 40, that's unreal. And if anybody thinks to a Bills fan, Chiefs fan, you can easily just think back. How many times would you see somebody come clean? Mahomes escapes, breaks contain, creates an explosive. And that's so much of what this new age of quarterback can do. Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Justin Herbert, Lamar Jackson, Aaron Rodgers was kind of the original piece when he started doing it. You've got these more mobile quarterbacks who, when they break contain, yes, they can scramble and hurt you with their legs, but they can also break contain and create explosives with their arm when they break contain. Mahomes has done it both ways to the Bills. He'll scramble for 25, and then he'll break contain and chuck one for about 35. The Bills could not get home in either game, especially in that playoff game. They revamped this defensive line to be able to impact the quarterback across the entire NFL, but especially the Kansas City Chiefs, to get to Patrick Mahomes, get home, take him down, and also fit the run and be able to impact this game. So can the Bills get home against Patrick Mahomes? And by extension, to your point, yeah, how do they fit everything against this offensive line in general? I think, to exactly your point, like I hate to really narrow it down to just this one thing, but I really think that's what decides the game. Like Bills D-line versus Chiefs O-line in terms of the run and the pass and what it does to Mahomes. I think that's the number one thing. And I think that's kind of makes sense given the fact that we both of our number ones kind of tied to that.
Came down to the same thing. Yeah. And that's what it is. For me, it's if either unit is dominant, then I think that kind of ends the game. If it's close enough to, even, then we're back into all the other points. Like that's kind of why I had to put it at 1. If this can come out as even, then we get back to everything else. But if the Bills can pressure Mahomes at 25%, 34%, whatever, and convert some to sacks, it's over. Like you can't, he will not be able to get pressured that much, especially if they can finish some of the sacks here and live. They also can't come out. And I know they want to rush for and, play a lot of coverage. But if you're only going to pressure him on, 15% of the things and just he's going to sit back there with all this time and the freedom to move, it's probably going to be game over that way too. And so that's the key matchup. And Allen's this way, Herbert, all these quarterbacks you mentioned. The thing about this is you can't have one guy get pressure on Patrick Mahomes. Like, yeah, a blindside sack's going to bring down any quarterback. But one guy that gets pressure that he can see or feel, which he's very good at, he is going to move away from it. And him and some of these other new quarterbacks, the way that they can move in any direction and still throw the ball accurately from there. You don't have to move on a set path. You don't have to roll backwards from where you are and to your right to make the throw. You don't have to run with your shoulders squared to the line of scrimmage. When only one guy gets a pressure, you're almost doing the Chiefs or the Bills a favor because now you get into scramble rules. And now all of a sudden your defensive rules don't really matter as much. Now all of a sudden you just have receivers that practice with this quarterback every day, just doing what they've been repping day in and day out versus, having a defense playing a specific coverage. Like if one guy forces a flush out of a pocket and he's just able to run, that's almost free money for him because he can throw the ball. I mean, everyone's kind of seeing these plays. Like he throws the ball from the stupidest angles I've ever seen. Like, I don't know how a body works that way. And all these quarterbacks do it too. Like, I'm not trying to diminish or just talk Mahomes only here, but like he seems to be under pressure a fair amount this year, but then he does that stuff. So if they can't get some, multiple guys on him, and I think the Bills have done a great job building out a full defensive line, not just adding Von Miller and saying, all right, we're good to go. They built a stable of guys. Multiple guys get pressured. That's kind of how you collapse down on them, and you get yourself a win.